everybody. Thank you so much for being here today. My name is Emily Sprenger. I'm an academic trainer for the Center for Teaching and Learning. I'm very happy to have Harvey Bakari come back and present for one of our CTL webinars. Absolutely. Couple of housekeeping things before we move on. The chat is available, so please feel free to post anything you'd like in the chat. Just remember, if you want everybody to see your comment or your question, please select the drop down and select all panelists and attendees. Otherwise, it just automatically defaults to Harvey and myself. Questions can be in the Q&A. And also, if you do want to raise your hand to ask a question, you're welcome to do that. And I will take questions when Harvey thinks it's an appropriate time to do so. So we have the president of Historical Services, Harvey Bakari, here to present his next presentation. And just a friendly reminder, he is coming back in August as well. So we're happy to have you all here today.
Well, thank you, Emily. And I'd like to welcome everyone back to my presentation for North Central University. This is the third presentation. And today it's our paradoxical inheritance. I'll tell you a little bit about myself as we go along in the presentation. But the paradoxical inheritance, you may wonder, what do I mean by that? And why is the title also King's Dream and Jefferson's Predictions? Well, that's going to reveal itself through the presentation. But our paradoxical inheritance has to do with the fact that a paradox is when you have two or more things that you're trying to reconcile that are difficult to reconcile. And of course, I'm going to be using inheritance in terms of our historical inheritance. What did we as Americans inherit from the past? But I'm also going to be using it in the terms of genealogical inheritance as well, because that genealogical inheritance kind of makes everything more relative, and you'll see as I go about. Because when you look at your genealogy and you bring genealogy and history together, then you're putting yourself, you're putting your lived experience and your ancestors' lived experience into history, so that history is not simply a bunch of dates and facts. I mean, the scholarship is great, but people sometimes are looking for that scholarship to fill in the blanks about their inheritance as Americans. And so this is an American paradox, and I will reveal it as we go further into the presentation. And so let me start with why. Let me start why with Jefferson and Martin Luther King. Well, King's Dream, Jefferson's Prediction. Most people, when you think of Thomas Jefferson, I would guess, I'm not sure, but most people probably would think of the Declaration of Independence. Now, he's had more accomplishments than that. He's been the president, two-term president of the United States. But I think many people would think of these words: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," written by Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence. Now, he was chosen to write and to draft that declaration, and we're going to learn more about that as we go along. But up from 1776 up until 1963, Martin Luther King, he's, again, he's a historical person that I think if most people, if you ask them, what's the first thing you think of with Martin Luther King? They might say, "I have a dream." And of course, during that speech in 1963, the March on Washington, he said, "I have a dream that one day we will live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." So here's the paradox. How do you take the American creed that all men are created equal? And of course, they mean mankind, not just men by sex, but they mean mankind. All men are created equal with the history of slavery. How do you reconcile those two? And that was one of the dilemmas facing the founding fathers and generations that followed. And this would be part of the inheritance of this American experience. Okay, so that's the connection I'm making between the two. Now, obviously, I could spend probably half the day telling you both of them have monuments in Washington, D.C. Both of them were college educated. Martin Luther King got his PhD at Boston University. Thomas Jefferson attended the College of Women Mary, and I could go on and on. But really, I'm trying to see and have a discussion about that paradox. How can you connect the two to make America live up to its creed? Let me give you I'm going to give you a very simple example. You know how at the beginning of the year, people make a New Year's resolution? They say, I'm going to the gym. I'm going to lose 50 pounds. Well, that's the idea. Sitting in front of the couch, eating food you shouldn't eat, makes it difficult to reconcile those two. Now, that may not be the best comparison, but it's an attempt to get you to understand that sometimes what we aim for and what's actually occurring are two different things. But bringing them together is a way to solve that paradox. So if you actually exercise, eat right, then you actually lose the weight. So again, it may not be the best comparison, but let's go forward. Now, Martin Luther King, of course, Jr., he was living at a time period of Jim Crow segregation, separate but equal. I'm part of that generation as well. I was a child during that time period. So you can see by these signs of segregation, a separate but equal America, that it's not living up to its creed. So that is the dilemma. How do you solve that problem? Perhaps there's one clue left also by Thomas Jefferson, because Thomas Jefferson, he liked to predict the future. And he once said the two races equally free cannot live in the same government. And he's talking about Blacks and whites, people of European heritage and people of African heritage as part of the American experience in the United States. And so certainly by the time of Martin Luther King's era and many other civil rights leaders, you can see that contradiction is there. America is separate, it is not equal, and African Americans did not have full citizenship rights. So where did this come from with Thomas Jefferson? And if you've seen some of my presentations before, I've used this same piece because this is part of Jefferson's prediction. And his prediction was that in the Book of Faith, that these people are to be free, speaking of the slaves, of course, enslaved Black people. Nor is it less certain that the two races equally free cannot live in the same government, which to me suggests that Jefferson knows something about this dilemma, this paradox that the founding fathers have inherited. And he's not seeing a way out. So he proposes or suggests a solution. One solution is emancipation of all the slaves and then deportation, send them all out of the country and then replace them with free white laborers or immigrants from Europe. So that's his theory. But it gives you a sense of him predicting that this dilemma of making the creed and all men are created equal a reality is going to be tough. And I know it's easy for people today, to try to say, well, they should have known better and so on and so forth. But as a public historian, we have to respect history and the time period. We have to respect how people thought in that time period and the dilemma that they faced. Another thing that I've learned from working at Colonial Williamsburg as a public historian is that the American Revolution, the changing of any government, is not the flip of a switch. It doesn't happen that easy. It looks easy in the history books. You go from being a colony, founding fathers, United States, Constitution. It was messy. I don't have time to get into it, but it was messy. No nation flips a switch. It's difficult to go from a republic. And so one of the problems that they had to address was this paradox of liberty and slavery. So just want to give you a quick background. Where did I get my public history experience from? To working at Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, people came to the foundation, to the museum. It's a large historical museum in Williamsburg, Virginia, to kind of engage in the past, to step back, to kind of feel the past, not to just read books or movies, but to actually go to places and spaces of the past. And the marquee of the foundation was the founding fathers, our Constitution, Declaration of Independence. It was my job and that of my colleagues as the manager of African American programs to show the other side of that existence in the 18th century, that these two things were part of the same experience. All of this is part of our cultural inheritance, whether it makes us comfortable, uncomfortable, whether we agree with it or try to put things under the carpet. You cannot extract the founding fathers from slavery. You cannot extract American slavery from the founding fathers in the founding of the nation, which I will reveal to you as we go through. So it was tough, but it was like a salmon swimming upstream. People wanted to see how the founding fathers lived, how the average gentry, the wealthy lived in their homes, what was their daily life like, what was their food like. And we had to integrate that experience and tell them 52% of that population was Black and enslaved. They were a part of everything that happened in that city of capital city of Williamsburg in the 18th century, as they were in other parts of the colonies that had a large Black population. So whether it's the apothecary or the print shop, you could go to the shoemaker, especially shoemakers, or the brickyard, any of those sawing, building, carpenters, clapboard carpenters, different skills, cabinet makers, blacksmiths, silversmiths, you will have found the Black hands of enslaved people, as well as free Blacks, in the city of Williamsburg in the 18th century. So that's why I say it's part of our inheritance as Americans, or at least the American history. Now, the other thing I learned very quickly in the museum is most people start, particularly African-American history, with Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation. They start in the 19th century, in the 1800s. But I focused on the time period from the 1600s all the way up to the early 1800s, which were the foundation of our nation and the foundation of the paradox that would play out in the time of Douglass, Tubman, and Lincoln. Now, I'm going to divide this presentation and the objectives in this presentation. The first part is going to be historical inheritance. And again, I'll interject a little bit about genealogy and DNA and why that's important to many African Americans, where history is more than just facts and dates. Second, we'll look at the pre-American Revolutionary era to kind of set up why the American Revolution was so important. Third, we'll look at the American Revolution itself. And then fourth, the post-American Revolutionary era, where the contradiction has come apart, or I should say the paradox is now facing the founding fathers, and then conclusion. Now, throughout the presentation, I'll stop. Emily may stop me to see if there are questions at this point. Let me just see if Emily has any questions. Any questions so far?
At this time, Harvey, not at the moment.
Okay. All right. So let's go on to the first segment, which is the historical inheritance. Now, the reason I'm going to interject genealogy and DNA, let me share a quick experience with you. Back in 1999, there was a conference at the at Colonial Williamsburg, as well as the College of William and Mary. It was a joint conference. And we had scholars from all over, just the premier scholars in the study of slavery. And they were fighting each other at that conference. They were going back and forth over their scholarship. And during the question and answer session of that presentation, with all the flow of scholarship and scholars disagreeing, there was a couple, African-American couple, who said, you know, I came to this conference. They said, we like your scholarship, but we came to this conference because we were trying to learn something about our ancestors. We were trying to find out if this information would be meaningful to us, if you will, filling in the gaps. And so that's why I'm going to introduce that into this presentation. So, for example, we are all here because of a man and a woman who go back centuries, as you see in this chart. And if one of them are taken out, then that means you're not here on Earth. That's the only way you're gonna come here on Earth, physically, biologically. And so you're part of your cultural, and this is part of your inheritance. And along the way, you are sometimes the history is connected with you. And with the African Americans, this inheritance extends from our African Americans inheritance, our genealogy, our historical inheritance. For some people, they see it as one and the same. It's not just scholarship. So let me explain if that was not clear. This is an example of the 1870 census records. For African Americans who are descendants of slaves, the 4 million slaves after the Civil War, this is the first time their ancestors, in this case, my great-grandfather. So I don't have to say great-great-great. I'm just saying my great-grandfather. So if any of you out there are grandparents, great-grandparents, if my great-grandparents were here, they would be slaves, formerly enslaved. So for African Americans, this document, and this is not, anything, this is a federal document. In 1870, 5 years after the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and also the 14th Amendment established that African Americans were citizens of the United States. This is the first time as families recognized as husbands, wives, children are officially recognized in the United States Census, which started in 1790, by the way, with Thomas Jefferson. And so this is a connection. This is part of an inheritance. So when I see my great-grandfathers and grandmother's names here, I know I am connected to this, as well as I am connected to the inheritance that goes along with it. Because as we will see, this is part of a history that is based on hereditary slavery. I'll say that again, hereditary slavery. And that's, again, the reason why I include genealogy and something else. Let me show you the something else. For many people of African descent whose legacy go back to 1870, who have ancestors who were here in 1870, there's another reality. And that reality is that oftentimes enslaved, their ancestors were the result of sexual engagement. It could be rape, it could be consensual. They are the offspring of slave masters and enslaved Black women. Now, there were other consensual offspring from Black men and white women. Now, that's another topic. I've touched on it before. It happened more than most people really think, particularly in the colonial time period. So when you look at for your ancestry, you can't use this piece of paper. It's not going to be there. Most slave owners would not identify who their offspring were. There are some instances, but in most cases, you don't. You have to refer to your DNA. So this is my DNA from 23andMe. I'm not representing 23andMe, full disclosure, but I'm just using it as a tool. This particular graph shows some of the admixture or different ancestors who made me possible here today, and their place of origin, their identity, their cultural identity or ethnicity. And I'm not going to go through this chart right now, but it's put on a timeline. It gives you a sense of when is it likely that your ancestor who was from the region of Ghana may have been alive. And so that's what this is meant to do. Now, it's not 100%, but it just gives you a suggestion. But I will reveal this information and how it's connected as we go along. So I'm connecting history and genealogy as well as DNA. Now I'm going to move on to the British colonial era, unless there's a question so far. Is it still?
No, Harvey, no questions at this time.
Okay, let me go to the British colonial era, because sometimes you hear people will say, and they're searching for answers. I'm not dismissing anyone or criticizing anyone. They will say something like, slavery has always been around. That's true. But what's going to happen here in what becomes the United States is slavery is going to meet an obstacle that it hadn't met before. So what I'm going to do with this segment is just to kind of build up how dark that moment was, that there was no light at the end of the tunnel before the American Revolution. It was not predicted. No one knew it was coming. Even up until the last part, people were trying to avoid fighting Great Britain. But people didn't know it was coming. But prior to that, for about 156 years, it's just doom. And I'm going to give you a sense of that doom and gloom from the enslaved people's perspective. But first, let's go to the British. Of course, the British age of exploration. Just a quick overview. As you look at these various charts, you look at the upper right chart of Europe, you'll see those circles. Those circles represent the European countries that were involved in the slave trade. The larger the circles, the more slave ships voyages originated from those countries, and of course brought back wealth to those countries in Europe. But I just want to keep everything in perspective. At that time period, at the age of exploration, the waterways, the ocean is the main means of transportation at that time period. It would be the space race of that time period. The Europeans were constantly fighting each other, but they were also fighting for control of the Americas as well as the slave trade. So when you see the map of Africa, you see those circles. The larger the circles, the more Africans were exported from those regions. But again, the Europeans, the French, the British, the Spanish, well, not the Spanish, the Portuguese, were fighting for control of those ports, so those places of exportation. Even when it comes to the Americas, the age of exploration began with the Spanish. The Spanish and the Pope gave them the entire Americas. Well, the Protestants were not going to stand for that. They were also going to come and colonize the Americas, which was going to mean death for a lot of indigenous people in the Americas. But again, even when you see these circles, those were the major ports that Africans were imported into the Americas. Once again, the Europeans were also fighting each other for control of those regions. So this is a time of colonization, a time of conquest. It was not a time where people were feeling, oh, this is, humanity and so forth. It's important to look at things in its time period. It's always tempting to apply modern concepts, modern values to the past, which means you're taking the past out of its context. Even if there were people who believed in humanity the way we do today, they were not in power. These were Christian kings, queens, monarchies, aristocracies, and all of the power was at those realms, as well as the church was in that realm. That would also result in the transatlantic slave trade. And as you can see on this map, the majority of enslaved Africans would be transported to Brazil, the Portuguese territory. The second largest would go to the Caribbean, which had a variety of Europeans who occupied various islands. The third largest group would be in Spanish America, particularly on the West Coast, Mexico, Central America, Chile, and so forth. And then the smallest percent, here this source says 600,000, some other sources say 400,000. But nevertheless, it's a great separation of Africans from their homeland, from their culture. Now, we're going to focus just on those who came to British North America. That small 4 or 5% of the 12 million or so Africans who survived, 11 million who survived the voyage out of about 12 million. Again, numbers vary from various sources. And we're going to focus on Virginia, 1619. When those first Africans arrived in Hampton in 1619, they were a minority. They didn't come in and instantly change everything. They were a minority. The majority of the interracial slaves and servants were white indentured servants, most of them voluntary, who chose to come as immigrants, others involuntary. There were also Native American slaves and servants as well. So initially, they found themselves isolated from their home country, their way of life, their culture, in a strange land of Virginia. Now, just 2 points I want to bring out, very important. What makes the slavery significantly different here in the Americas compared to historical slavery? And that would be hereditary slavery. Sometimes people were slaves in the past. It meant that individual was a slave. It didn't mean it was passed on to their children. But this would become one that's part of our American inheritance. Hereditary slavery, which means the status of the mother, status of the child. So it's going to pass down to the child, no matter if the husband is white, free Black, Native American, it doesn't matter, as long as the mother was Black and enslaved. Also, fornication between Negroes and whites were also prohibited and illegal by law. Next law, because I don't want to take up too much time with that, is who shall not hold office, which now means that you cannot hold office to be able to change your condition. Any Negro, nor any Negro, mulatto, and mulatto would be a biracial person, or Indian shall bear any office, ecclesiastical, civil, military, to be in any place of public trust or power. So there's nothing you can do about your condition, whether you are enslaved or if you are free Black. So that's a very important point. So by the time you get to the 1790s, that's when Virginia becomes a slave society. That's when the numbers of Africans are starting to increase. The sex ratio between males and females, because there were more African males initially than females, which means your population is going to grow very slow. But as the sex ratio between African males and females begin to even out, then you start to have an increase in the population, as well as there were others who were the children, biracial children of slave owners and enslaved Black women. So how did people feel about that? Our best example, at least I argue, is the people of Boston, the Blacks of Boston. They were very active, and they left us this primary document. You can Google it at any time, the Boston Petition of 1773 with the Massachusetts Historical Society. And they said, the humble petition of many slaves living in the town of Boston, in our town, neither they nor their children to all generations shall ever be able to do or to possess and enjoy anything, no, not even life itself, but in the manner as a beast that perish. So that's telling you their life is meaning, there's no dreams to have. It's meaningless. You're just slavery. You're just working for someone. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. So for those first 150 years, it's just like generation after generation, your child's going to be a slave. It's this inheritance, this hereditary slavery, one generation after the next generation. The other thing to remember when you're dealing with history, which sometimes is difficult to convey to people, is you don't know the outcome. I dare anyone here to say that they knew in 2019, oh, 2020 is going to be a wash. There's going to be a pandemic. We're going to be at home. We're going to be using Zoom. No, you didn't know that, except for the few experts who work in that field. They might have predicted it. But you never know the outcome. So every year goes by. It's slavery for yourself. It's slavery for your children. It's slavery for your grandchildren. It's slavery for your great-grandchildren. 156 years. So further in that document, they said, and this is very profound if you think about it, we have no property, we have no wives, no children, we have no city, no country. And it was signed by Felix. So that's giving you a sense of how hopeless it feels for enslaved people. Even though their lives vary from north to south, some are domestic slaves, some are urban slaves and so forth. It's just no hope. It's continuous. No one knows what's going to break it. So by 1774, once again, and this is very important, you can see the Blacks of Boston have really been putting a lot of thought in writing. Now, the whole story of literacy and slaves writing, that would be a different presentation. So I'm not going to address that right now, but they did. And here's one evidence primary document. They say, we are a freeborn people and have never forfeited this blessing by any compact or agreement whatever. So what are they saying? They're saying, look, we didn't agree to be enslaved here in the Americas. There was no contract like the indentured servants. The indentured servant, that's what it means. Indentured is a contract, had a contract for 5 to 7 years to pay for their voyage across the Americas. These Africans in Boston, these Blacks in Boston are saying, there's no contract. So they're acting as their own attorney, if you will. But they go on to say, just to give you a sense of it, because sometimes people say, oh, this is a nation of immigrants. Well, if they tell you that, they're not being, either they're not fully informed or they're not telling you, they're not being genuine, openly genuine with you. Because even, I would say one of my favorite people, Barack Obama, says the same thing. And honestly, I cringe every time he says it. Because listen to this primary document of people who lived in that time period, where they say, some of us stolen from the bosoms of our tender parents and from a populous, pleasant, and plentiful country, brought hither to be made slaves for life in a Christian country. So there is no future. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. But they're looking back, because what they're talking about with their populous country, they're talking about the fact that they came from a country where they had their history, they had their culture, they had their expectations, they had their inheritance from their parents that they had expected, but it was interrupted by the slave trade. Now, I don't have time to go into the history of the continent of Africa, but there were many different kingdoms, whether it's the Nile Valley of Egypt, Nubia, Ethiopia and East Africa, or Zimbabwe, Timbuktu, Mali, Ghana, Shanghai. It's an extensive history, but that's what they were taken from. That's what they meant when they said they were taken from a prosperous and pleasant country. But why are these people so well informed in Boston? Probably because of this. This is probably, particularly for my generation, many Blacks would only know of Crispus Attucks because of the Boston Massacre. Now, here he is in this particular rendition because each artist created their own version of what happened. So this is an artist's interpretation of the Boston Massacre. But he makes Crispus Attucks a former slave who's in Boston, who was hanging out with the whites of Boston. And he's one of the first people that shot. So the artist is trying to emphasize that. So the Blacks in Boston appear to be very engaged with the ideas of the American Revolution. Because if you're in Boston, they're going to be around their owners. They're everywhere, just like, well, no, I shouldn't say everywhere. The population is not as great as Virginia, but they're in those settings. They're listening to those conversations in the taverns. They're listening to the gentlemen. They're listening to the craftsmen as they talk about these ideas of the Enlightenment and natural rights and so forth. So they are very well informed, and thanks to them, they've left us some documentation. Now, seems like, is there a question?
I do have a quick question, actually.
Yes.
RM wanted to know, what was the primary religion of Africa during that time period, this time period you're speaking of, where they're being taken to the other countries?
Okay, if they were, some of the Africans near Ghana, Senegambia, many of them were Muslims by that time period. In Angola had become Christians because of the Portuguese missionaries. So some of the earliest generations of Africans captured in the 1600s came from Angola. Some of them had Christian names. There's a whole story of the Portuguese priests making efforts, not just to baptize some of the African captives, but to baptize them in their language. So they would teach Africans the Bible and so forth, and bless them, but nevertheless, they would still be enslaved. Then you also have traditional religions that exist in variations throughout the area of West Africa, but those are just two of the Judeo-Christian religions of that time period.
And then I know you're specifically talking about North America, and you mentioned indentured slaves, maybe that 5 to 7 year time frame before they're free.
Yes.
There was a couple slides back where it said something about a 31-year term.
Yes.
Is that did the other countries have similar laws to North America? Did the rules that were come up, were they mirrored off of other countries, or was it just made up per the region?
There is some historical debate amongst historians as to whether those laws were influenced by the laws of the British colony of Barbados. That the importation of Africans into the Caribbean happened. As a matter of fact, about 500,000 Africans were already in South America, Central America, the Caribbean, before the first Africans arrived in 1619 in Virginia. So the British had other territories, and it's believed that they used because they had a connection, obviously, between the colonies and the mainland, that those laws may have influenced laws here in Virginia. So, okay. So there's debate. Okay, oh, now in terms of the 31 years, I just didn't have enough time to go into that, but I'll just say it real quickly. A mulatto child, because of the fact that eventually interracial marriages would be declared illegal in 1691 in Virginia, and it varies from colony to colony. So from 1691, interracial marriages were forbidden. That meant that if there was a union between in most cases, an enslaved Black man and a white woman, that mulatto child or biracial child would have to serve as if they were an orphan. They would have to serve as an apprentice for 31 years, or to the age of 31, let me be more exact. And that was their punishment for being a illegitimate child outside of a legal marriage. Did that make sense?
Yes, it does. But what's the lifespan that time? I mean, 31 seems to be.
Yes, the lifespan was about 40 years of age. So if you research which I've done, research like runaway ads, it was not uncommon to find mulattoes who are running away and many who are also declaring their freedom. As a matter of fact, I talked a little bit about it in the last presentation with Thomas Jefferson representing Samuel Howell, who was disputing his condition. So it was not uncommon.
Harvey, we do have one more question. Do we have time for
Yes, that's fine.
Okay, great. Greg, I'm going to go ahead and allow you to ask your question. You should be able to unmute yourself. I hope.
How's that?
That's great. Thank you.
Okay, I was just reflecting and thinking over the past couple hundred years. You suppose, maybe this is just a theoretical question, do you suppose that if America had gotten off on a better footing, theory into practice, that all, not men but people, were created equal, do you suppose that everyone has equality, the opportunity, and so on and so forth? So do you suppose that incidences that are happening, like, well, just recently, the racial clashes and so on and so forth, maybe that could have been minimized, if not prevented altogether? And that's just a reflection.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, that's all. I was just saying that's just a reflection.
Okay. From my observation and from my opinion, the dilemma that the founding fathers faced, again, because no one knows the future, and they continuously make this point that they inherited the slave trade and slavery from their British forefathers. And so they really had no choice. As a matter of fact, they were trying at one time in Virginia, the legislatures, they were trying to prevent, or I should say, curtail the slave trade into Virginia because they were concerned about how many Africans are being brought into Virginia. And the king is making money off the slave trade. And king was like, no, I'm not going to stop this. This is so. It seems that perhaps at the early part of the century, perhaps that, and this is just my theory, is that the early colonists may have, but I have no documentation to support this, may have wanted this colony, to be a all European American colony. If that were the case, there probably would not have been the contradiction at the end, but that's just speculation.
Yeah.
But the fact that they began to engage in importing more and more Africans to become the labor source, and again, they had no idea they were going to break away from Great Britain. That becomes part of their experience. And so once that time does come, where the Age of Enlightenment, the American Revolution, which is the part I'm going to next, the American Revolution, and they do in fact defeat Great Britain and they do separate themselves from the monarchy, then they are looking at the country and they're like, oh, all men are created equal, but we got Native Americans here, Africans here, and how are we going to reconcile this? So again, understanding that they didn't know the outcome, how it was going to turn out, created that dilemma. But I think if they thought that, hey, we can create this colony with just Europeans, whether they're indentured servants or immigrants, and we're not going to use slave labor, we're not going to use the labor of Native Americans, we're just going to use European labor, that would be a good, what they call science fiction history, I forgot what the term is, history where, what would have happened if Africans were never brought to the colonies? How long would it have taken for the whites, the colonists, to build the colonies? And would the Native Americans have built up enough confederations to defeat the Europeans, and so on and so forth? So, so I think they did, and also to be fair to the founding fathers, to the American Revolutionary generation, they didn't have a blueprint for what they were about to do. The British didn't have the blueprint in Britain, so their ancestors didn't have a blueprint to give them. So they found themselves, I shouldn't say found themselves because they were benefiting from the slavery, but they did discover, okay, how do we get out of this situation? How do we reconcile it?
Someone popped in the chat. Thank you, Greg. I do appreciate that. Someone popped in the chat, alternate history fiction.
That's it. Yes, yes, yes. Yes, that's what
I'm
it's
going to
called. I
let
couldn't
you move
remember.
on. There was another question, but I'm going to let you move on first and see if we have some more time at the end.
Okay. All right. So now we're going to look at the American Revolution. Why is the American Revolution, particularly for people who are descendants of slaves and free blacks in the United States, why was it so important? It's because it was going to be a time of choices. Remember, before the American Revolution, slavery was part of an ancient tradition. It was not really questioned. It was respectable. The slave trade was respectable. Kings and queens, Queen Elizabeth, and you go down the line, queens of Spain, churches, the Vatican, respectable. The American Revolution was going to change that because now these ideas of the Age of Enlightenment were going to cause slavery to be questioned. But even more important for the enslaved, now they had an opportunity to change their condition. So real quickly, first, the British offer any slave of an American patriot the opportunity to bear arms and serve His Majesty if you could make it to Norfolk, Virginia. Now, that would also include women and children. Even though he didn't say women and children, they went regardless. Women, children, elders, some people who were infirmed, a blind Baptist preacher named Moses Wilkerson from Portsmouth, Virginia. He also went to join the British. Let me see if I can move that. Nope, wrong. Now, the Americans, on the other hand, they're not offering freedom to the enslaved people. So what's going to happen there is that the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson chosen to draft it, we hold these truths to be self-evident. This is hope that if the Americans win, and no one knows who's going to win the war, the British is one of the most powerful armies and navies, professional in the world. So the colonists don't know if they're going to win the war. The founding fathers, if they're not successful, they could be traitors and they could be executed. So for the first time, there's some light at the end of the tunnel. It's not a bright light, but it's a light. So you can choose whether to go to the British or go to the Americans. So first, let's take a quick look at those who went to the British, which I think if you've seen my presentations before, you've seen that those who went to the British after the war, about 4 times as many, joined the British. They left out of New York, Savannah, and Charleston, and their destinations were Florida, the British Caribbeans, Canada, England, and others relocated to Sierra Leone, West Africa. As we move to the Revolution, those who chose the Americans, here is an important part of Jefferson's writing on the Declaration of Independence. This is his first draft of the Declaration of Independence. And so you'd have to look for this. You can Google it, but it's not in the final draft, of course. But his longest complaint and his most direct attack on King George III was in this passage in reference to the slave trade. And he says he has waged a cruel war against human nature itself. It is the warfare of the Christian king of Great Britain, who has an open market where men, and the uppercase are Jefferson's uppercase. That means you're shouting when you're doing a text message. So I think he's emphasizing the Christian and emphasizing men when he's referring to the African people. An open market where men should be bought and sold. He is now enticing those very people to rise in arms amongst us. And those are the ones who serve the British. So think about it for a moment. If you join the Americans, that means part of the cultural inheritance would be being part of the soldiers, about 5,000 or so, who fought for American independence. That's part of the inheritance also of African Americans. It's our cultural inheritance, particularly if your ancestors can be found on the 1780 census. There's a good chance that they're 1 or 2 generations away from the revolutionary generation. And so about 5,000 African-American soldiers would fight. In this case, we're representing, this was a program at Colonial Williamsburg I was the manager of. We're representing the American troops of the Rhode Island Regiment. with General Lafayette on horseback, the French allies of the Americans. But these men were taking a chance that they believed in these ideas that all men are created equal. And they would serve, many of them would go home, and they would receive pensions and so forth. Again, I could talk more about it, but I just want to get the main point across with the revolution. So let's see if there are any questions.
I do. I have
as
a
we move to the
question.
American Revolution, post-revolution. Yes.
Yes, actually, and it is actually has to deal with what happened with slavery the few years after winning the revolution. Just a couple of things. Can you drag me over just a little bit? Thank you.
Yes. I was trying to find that the whole time. Yes.
No, that's no worries. So this question is from James. The question is, many of the northern states outlawed slavery within a few years of winning the revolution.
Yes.
Do you think that this is an important fact overlooked by our society and culture today? So that's question one. And then in kind of adding on to that,
yes.
Were there some states that were more progressive than we want to give history credit for?
Okay, let me, as a matter of fact, I'm going to touch on that part in this chat, in this section about the increase of the gradual emancipation in the North. During the American Revolution, there was already conflicts that would actually take place later with the Civil War. Many of those conflicts were very early. There was a North-South division. There were things that Northerners would say about Southerners and vice versa. Also, there was gradual emancipation in the North. There were some people who felt that the American Revolution was inconsistent with the idea of slavery. Even Southerners also felt that, and I'm going to touch on that in just a moment. The second part, in terms of being progressive for that time period, let me see if I can address that near the end, because I want to make sure I can finish this. All right, so as we move to the post period, this is the important time period because now the Americans have defeated the British and they've got a new nation. And like I said, you cannot flip a switch to start a new nation. New nations take a long time. It's very difficult. It's very messy. There's a lot of people are contesting. Should we continue to have an official church for the nation, or should we have the separation of church and state? Should we have a federalist government or a constitutional government? There's no easy answer, and there's a lot of debates to get towards that time period. But for enslaved people, it was going to be a time of hope that perhaps this new government that believe in these ideals, this creed that all men are created equal, you have an increase in the free Black population, primarily in the North, where you have gradual emancipation. But also in Virginia and North Carolina, there's the allowed to individually free their slaves. It was called manumission in Virginia. Also, there were Black institutions that were beginning, organizations, and the earliest organizations were named African. They had pride in their African heritage, such as the African Baptist Church, the African Methodist Church, the African Zionist Church, also the African Lodge, the Freemasons, today known as Prince Hall Freemasons, started during the American Revolutionary time period, or I would say the American Revolutionary generation, Black, white, and Native American. Now, here's a picture of me when I was portraying the Baptist preacher who was the founder of one of the earliest Baptist churches in the United States in Williamsburg, Virginia. He was the co-founder, and Colonial Williamsburg is doing some archaeology on that church as we speak. So let's get back to Jefferson's prediction. So Jefferson this is when his prediction came about, because after the revolution. And I've read this before. He believes the two races equally free cannot live in the same government. So when the new Constitution is ratified, some of the hopes of African Americans are dashed because some of them may have been, having thought there would be a long shot that there would be a general emancipation for all enslaved people. There would be an increased, or I should say, general emancipation for all of enslaved people in the United States, but that did not happen with the 12 amendments of the Constitution. But they still had hope. Now, today we have, I know there every day in the papers and so forth, in the news, you hear things about critical race theory and so forth. Well, for the founding fathers generation, or I should say the American Revolutionary generation, they used this term. They said it was the race problem. I'm showing you a map of what the United States looked like at the time of George Washington in 1783. There were people who were saying maybe we should put the whites in one part of the United States, the enslaved people in another, I mean, the Black people in another part, and the Native Americans in another. I mean, there was just different ideas going about because, again, a new nation, you cannot flip a switch. But there were other things that were going on. While many were trying to figure out where Blacks belong, many of them were celebrating the fact that they had been part of that American Revolutionary generation. And unfortunately, now this is from a Boston newspaper, every year, yes, Blacks did celebrate the 4th of July before Frederick Douglass made his famous speech about what is the value, I can't remember the title of the 4th of July. Yes, they did. People were proud of their fathers, their brothers, their sons who had fought in the American Revolutionary War, and they would participate in parades held in Boston and other parts, particularly in the North. I have to do some research for the South. And they would march at the end of the parade. But eventually what happened is some of the whites in Boston didn't like the ideas of the Blacks being part of that parade. And then you have the introduction of ridiculing Blacks to say that they're part of this degraded race. They don't deserve to be Americans. So you can see in this particular newspaper article, it's called the Grand Bobolation of Slavery. It's supposed to be the grand abolition of slavery or the slave trade, what they're really celebrating. And you can see, as you can read if you can read the words, you can see they're already starting what would, and this is early 18th century, what would later become part of blackface and minstrel shows and Black vernacular. They're already starting that in the early part of the country. They're saying the grand and most benevolent celebration and so forth, the abomination of slavery and so forth. So you can see that occurring as the new nation is forming who's American and who's not American. So it was not an easy question to ask, but this is to answer. But this is how some people are resulting to ridicule as a way to degrade African Americans. Even if they were free Blacks and they were successful, they would always be susceptible to that. So the critical race theory is nothing, I mean, well, it may be new for this time period, but it was a real question that the revolutionary generation was dealing with at that time period. So here are a couple of solutions that people came up with. They thought deportation, colonization, maybe even the illegal slave trade, that these would be some of the solutions of what to do with free Black people. Now I'm going to go through it very quickly so I can get to the conclusion. One is the American Colonization Society. Jefferson talked about it. So if you decided, if you were, your ancestors on here from 1870 at the United States Census, probably their grandparents had to deal with this question. Do you stay in the United States and fight to be an American citizen, deal with all of the indignities, but be persistent about being an American citizen? Or do you immigrate to Liberia, where about 14,000 people went, most from Virginia as Christian missionaries, and the first president of Liberia was from Richmond, Virginia. The next solution, now this was something that happened after the slave trade was ended, the domestic slave trade. Again, this is reflected in the census records. Even my great-grandfather left a story about how he was sold from Virginia to Louisiana. After hearing the story, it was handed down from one generation to another. I decided to look forward, and sure enough, I did find out with this documentation, the census, and another documentation that yes, he was part of the domestic slave trade. This was American-born Blacks who were sold from the upper South, Virginia, Maryland, to the lower South for King Cotton. And if you saw the movie Django Unchained at the beginning, where they have the men in coffles and in chains and two men on horseback, that reflects this watercolor painting that was taken from life. It's a life painting of what an artist saw at that time period. It was a common appearance at that time period. Very quickly, the track that my grandfather, great-grandfather would have taken would have been from Virginia to Louisiana. He would have marched by land because he said specifically he went by land. Others would be sent by ship or steamship from Norfolk, Charleston, Wilmington, Savannah to the lower South. Another solution, the illegal importation of Africans into the Americas after the slave trade ended. Again, the newspaper article are the Blacks celebrating the end of the slave trade when Congress ended the slave trade in 1808. Little did they know that an illegal trade would continue until the beginning of the Civil War. And again, here's another map, gives you a sense of how the Africans were illegally smuggled. And once again, my DNA, as well as some of my genealogical information, indicates that I do have another great-great-grandfather who was perhaps one of the victims of the illegal smuggling, many times Northerners. So many times people like to just point at the South, but many times Northern investors would have ships go to Africa, particularly the Brown brothers of Brown University would engage in the illegal trafficking of Africans into the Americas. Now, my time is running short, but this goes back to the question raised earlier. The other solution was the age-old solution of using the laws. But you can see in these laws, I just picked out a few because I want you to see how the attitude towards free Blacks and slaves shift over time. First, right after the Revolutionary time period, people are excited. So there's in Virginia, this is just Virginia, there's the manumission law, which means slave owners can free their slaves. And there were many who thought slavery and liberty were inconsistent, and they freed their enslaved people. Then any soldier who fought for the American Revolution, they passed a resolution, they must be freed as if never enslaved. So you see this upswing. But then there's the backlash. By 1797, the free Black population in Virginia and Maryland are increasing. And so now free Blacks have to register in the county in which they live. By 1805, the backlash against free Blacks is going even further. It said that if you free your slaves, they must leave Virginia within 1 year. So what that means is, how does this impact the family? Let me just tell you real quickly. That would be like this. Let's say your husband and wife, just in this example, husband and wife, and you have kids. Okay, as the husband, it's all you men, if you're the husband, you are a free Black in this particular model. You're the free Black. Your wife is a slave. So that means your children are slaves. You can do one or two things. You can raise money to purchase your wife's freedom and your children. But the question becomes, do you legally free them? Because if you free your wife and children in the courts, they have to leave Virginia. You might have land here. You don't know, where to go. You may not be welcome. But those are some of the dilemmas that played out in many families of people who are descendants of this 1870 document. Those are real issues they had to deal with. Later on, they said you could petition to remain in Virginia. Also, some Blacks petitioned to be re-enslaved once they were free. I know it sounds, there's a book called Family Bond. Some Blacks petitioned to be re-enslaved because they rather not leave Virginia. That's another story within itself. Lastly, there were conspiracies and rebellions. The main point I'll make here is that after the American Revolution, they were large scale. The rebellions before the American Revolution tend to be regional, very small scale conspiracies and rebellions. After the Revolution, they're very large scale. I'm going to conclude with this because we're coming right at the end of the time. For this presentation, I'm going to conclude with Supreme Court decision with Dred Scott.
And
because
just
the question,
so you know, Harvey, go right ahead.
Yes.
It's okay if we go over a little bit. That's totally fine.
Okay.
So just so you know.
Okay, I'm still going to try to aim for it. Dred Scott decision. What was important about this decision is part of the legacy of the dilemma. The Supreme Court said that the question before us is, can a Negro whose ancestors were imported into this country and sold as slaves become a member of the political community formed and brought into existence by the Constitution of the United States, and as such become entitled to all the rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by that instrument to the citizen? So this has far-ranging consequences. That's the question. So how do they answer that? They said, we think Justice Taney, I should say, in the Dred Scott case. Justice Taney says, we think not, and that they are not included and were not intended to be included under the word citizens in the Constitution, and can therefore claim none of the rights and privileges. They were at the time considered as subordinate and inferior class of beings who had been subjugated by the dominant race and were emancipated or not, yet remained subjects to their authority and had no rights or privileges. So he's essentially saying that free Blacks and slaves, nor their future generations, can be citizens of the United States because the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence did not include them. Well, Frederick Douglass had something to say about that. Sometimes what happens in history is that by the time of 1857, many of the American Revolutionary generation had passed. The generation of Black and white Americans who fought for the country together, white soldiers had fought with Black soldiers, many of them had passed. And you have influx of immigrants who have no connection to the American Revolutionary generation. So they had no connection, and in some cases, whether it's intentionally or unintentionally, just forgot much of the American Revolution generation, particularly the participation of African Americans. So Frederick Douglass said, no, Justice Taney, you're not right. Let me go back. Justice Taney, you're not right. After the American Revolution, there were religious denominations who made a decision that their religious denominations were going to oppose slavery. There were people who freed their slaves. It was not an agreed upon consensus that all white Americans believed that Blacks were not included in the Declaration of Independence and Constitution. As a matter of fact, what was also forgotten by Frederick Douglass himself, that he didn't mention when he responded to the Dred Scott case, is the participation of African Americans in the War of Independence, actually fighting on the field side by side with white soldiers for American independence. And so when you have generations of people who forget the American Revolutionary generations, then you have this disconnect. And I suggest, whether it's intentional or just a byproduct of generational separations, who have lost appreciation for the American Revolutionary generation. So even Frederick Douglass, as I said, later on, Frederick Douglass said, I can't remember the title right now about the 4th of July, but yes, Blacks did in fact celebrate the 4th of July. They were proud of their Black veterans of the American Revolution. Many of those soldiers, particularly in the North, places like Rhode Island, Vermont, and Massachusetts, many of them received a pension, a state pension. Some of them received a federal pension for their service. If they were not alive, their family members received it. Others also, very few of them, received land for their service as soldiers in the American Revolutionary War. Many of them, one of the soldiers I portrayed, Prince Vaughn, his discharge papers were signed by General George Washington, as well as many of the other Black soldiers who were part of the speckled troop of men who fought for American freedom and American independence. But it gives you a sense of what can happen when generations of people and people who have no connection to the previous generation's accomplishments can cause history to be forgotten. Now you can argue whether, oh, they forgot it on purpose or was it a byproduct of the events? That's for debate. But the reality is, it seems that most people had forgotten that American Revolutionary generations that included Blacks and whites, particularly those who were optimistic for that short period of time. I don't have time to go into the optimism, particularly with churches and religions, and you had interracial church congregations for a while. But what curtailed that and what curtailed the early part of abolition movements was the pro-slavery, because the pro-slavery movement was like, wait, you're freeing these people? You're saying that they should be free? No, we think they should be slaves, and here are the reasons why. And they began to use religion, philosophy, and it would carry itself on into the time of the Civil War. But it starts at the early part of the founding of the nation, and it becomes a legacy that Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Abraham Lincoln, and that generation, the Civil War generation, had to try to resolve. So at that point, I think That's the conclusion. Just to kind of bring it back to Jefferson and King again, after the American Revolutionary generation, Martin Luther King is still struggling for citizenship rights in his generation, and my generation as well. But before his generation, he was not struggling for something that was not already in place. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment had already established citizenship rights. That was a time period when the United States was taking the effort to try and resolve that paradoxical creed that all men are created equal by ending slavery with the 13th Amendment, by establishing citizenship rights for Blacks with the 14th Amendment and equal protection, and then voting rights for Black men with the 15th Amendment and the ability to hold office to try to change one's condition. So I'm going to end it right here. And when I do the next presentation in August, I'll pick up from this point before you get to Reconstruction. So any questions I can entertain at this point?
Yeah, there are a few. First of all, several people have said excellent presentation, and
well, thank you.
Yes, and I wanted to share that, of course. Let's see. Excellent presentation. The intersection between DNA research, Ancestry, 23andMe, and traditional history is fascinating. Do you envision museums and history departments merging these areas on a wider scale?
I would have to leave that up to people in academia to debate that, because in many cases, I don't know if things have changed. I guess it depends on what institution you're looking at. In many cases, there's a divide between genealogy and history. History is seen, of course, the study of history in academia came about in the late 1800s, but genealogy was never really able to get that same type of accreditation, if you will. Now, I know they do have it in certain colleges and universities and so forth, but it would be, let me just put it this way, it would be interesting. It would be interesting, but as a public historian, one of our goals is to try to make the history as relative to people as possible, and not just present facts and dates and try to engage people as much as possible, and to make it meaningful. Why are you telling me this? What does it mean to me? How am I a part of this? How will this help me see the world perhaps differently than I've seen it before?
And someone actually just put in the chat too, the AA Museum in DC has devoted an area to genealogy and history. So just, I guess, again, depends on the institution itself.
Yes.
Another couple of questions that I saw in the Q&A and the chat, and I think you can probably all this together. Do you feel that the fight for citizenship is still a problem today? And again, and the other part that may go on this is reducing the stigma of systematic racism. Some of
those are big questions.
I know they're huge. They're huge.
Oh yeah, that's a big question. They said systematic racism. Did they say?
Yeah, reducing the stigma of it.
Oh, the stigma of racism. Oh wow. Okay. There's so many angles I can take to address that question, but I would say that if you get a chance, read Martin Luther King's last sermon at Ebenezer Church called "The Drum Major Instinct." And the drum major instinct, he was saying, is basically the fact that how do you control one's ego and one's pride? And that even if a white person, he was suggesting, for example, a white person could vote or select someone that actually is against their own self-interest, just because they may not like Blacks or another group of people. And so he saw that as a problem to resolve race, because he even said, some of the whites who, and he's talking at the time of segregation, he's saying, look, he was referring to a conversation he had in the Birmingham jail with some of the white segregationists. And he said, look, some of you should be joining us in the Poor Man's March. He said, yeah, you may not like us because we're Black and you believe X, Y, and Z, He said, but when it comes down to it, you want to send your child to college. You want to be able to have a job where you're not working from paycheck to paycheck. We have some of the same self-interest, but he said, but you're giving in to the oppressor of both of us because it makes you feel better. And I'm paraphrasing, you can read it yourself. So if I misquote, but he was basically saying it makes you feel better to feel that you're superior or better than a Black person, but you're actually doing things that are detrimental to yourself. So again, it's another type of paradox. Now, he says it more eloquently than I just said it, but if you read it, that's the 68 version of Martin Luther King, who is very different from the 63 version of Martin Luther King.
The drum major instinct, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Matter of fact, that's part of the sermon that's etched on his monument in Washington, D.C.
All right, thank you. And then I guess just to make sure we addressed it, do you still, feel that there's a fight for citizenship and that is still an issue in today's world?
I'm not sure if the question means citizenship in terms of
I guess that's true.
Others who are trying to come into the country versus this 1870 citizenship of the. Now, one thing I will say is for African-American descendants of the free Blacks and slaves in the United States who are on the 1870 census records, they're 5 years away from being freed from about 4 million people from slavery, 4 million people. And the 14th Amendment says that they are citizens of the United States because the radical Republicans in Congress, the legislative branch of the government, understood that if they did not pass a constitutional amendment to allow my great-grandparents to be citizens of the United States, that the South would, once they came back into the Union, would take away citizenship rights. So therefore, they made sure it was a constitutional amendment, which many other people have been able to benefit from. So if someone is coming into the country and they become an American citizen, or they come into the country and they're not a citizen, if their child is born into the country because of the 14th Amendment, which made my great-grandparents citizens, their child born in the United States automatically becomes a citizen. Now, when they created the 14th Amendment, they didn't know, again, they didn't know what's going to happen in the future. It was immediately at that point to ensure that my great-grandparents were going to be citizens of the United States and no state government would be able to take that away. But others have been able to benefit from it. There's even industries of people who fly into the country to have babies in the country so their children will have dual citizenship. But this is the original purpose, was for my great-grandparents by the radical Republicans. So it depends on what that person meant by citizenship.
I guess that's true. It could have been a completely different webinar, yes. But I still appreciate that you tied it back into your list there in terms of the citizenship. So, so as always, Harvey, we're just so grateful that you take the time to share your knowledge and the history with us. And I know several people mentioned in the chat, whether you're learning it for the first time or you're revisiting it, it's very important, and applied knowledge is power. And we really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with us each time you have come. And I look forward to your webinar in August as well. I just want to thank everybody for joining us today, and we will see you all again in August. So thank you all for your time.
Thank you. My pleasure.